I didn't hang up the call, and what my own daughter said about me in the next 30 seconds is the reason her wedding almost never happened. Before I tell you what I did next, take 1 second, like this video, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are not just stories, they are warnings. Now let me take you back to the exact moment everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind that feels ordinary enough to fool you into thinking your life is still safe. I was in my kitchen, standing exactly where I've stood for the last 27 years, making tea the same way I've made it since Rachel, my daughter, my only child, was in middle school and needed something warm after long days she never talked about. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 65 years old, a retired school principal, and I have spent my entire life believing that if you raise a child with values, the world can't take them away. That afternoon proved to me how wrong I was. My phone rang and I saw Rachel's name. I smiled the way mothers do when their child calls, even when that child is 33 years old and hasn't needed you in years. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, already reaching for a second cup. There was noise on the other end. Movement. Voices. Then Rachel said, distracted, "Mom, hold on 1 second." That should have been my first sign, not the words, the tone. When your child starts asking you to wait, you're already no longer part of the conversation. I didn't hang up. I didn't even think to. I just stood there holding the phone, listening, and then I heard another voice. Smooth, controlled. The kind of voice that never raises itself because it doesn't need to. That was Victoria Cole, Rachel's future mother-in-law. A woman I had met exactly 3 times. A woman who smiled at me like she was measuring something she hadn't decided was worth keeping. "Rachel, darling," Victoria said, "we need to be realistic about the guest experience." Guest experience. I remember that phrase because it sounded like something you say about a hotel, not a wedding. Rachel didn't respond immediately. That silence told me more than anything she could have said. Victoria continued, gentle as silk, "Your mother, she's very present." I froze. Not because I didn't understand what she meant, but because I understood it perfectly. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked quietly. I leaned against the counter, my tea forgotten, my hand tightening around the phone just enough to remind myself this was real. Victoria let out a soft laugh. "Darling, let's not pretend. She's strong, opinionated. She doesn't quite blend with the atmosphere we're creating." Blend. Atmosphere. Words chosen carefully so they don't sound like what they really are. Rejection. And then came the sentence that changed something inside me forever. "I think it would be best if she had a limited role, perhaps seated further back. Less visible." Less visible. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. Because at 65, you learn something most people don't understand. Pain doesn't always explode. Sometimes it sharpens. Rachel spoke again, and this is the part that stayed with me longer than anything Victoria said. "I know," she said softly. "I've been thinking the same thing." I closed my eyes, not because I couldn't handle it, but because I needed to feel it fully. That sentence wasn't influenced. It wasn't pressured. It was agreed. My daughter, the girl I raised, the girl who used to hold my hand like I was the safest place in the world, had just quietly confirmed that I didn't belong in her new life. And the conversation didn't stop there. That's the part people always think is the worst moment, but it wasn't. It got worse. Victoria lowered her voice slightly, the way people do when they believe they are saying something sensitive, when in reality they are saying something cruel. "After the wedding," she said, "it will be easier. Distance happens naturally. Visits become occasional. It's better for everyone that way." Better for everyone. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't defend me. She didn't even hesitate. "Yeah," she said, "I think that would be easier." Easier. That word echoed in my mind longer than anything else. Because I suddenly understood something I had never allowed myself to see. I didn't raise a daughter who forgot me. I raised a daughter who learned that convenience matters more than loyalty. I stood there in my kitchen, holding a phone that had suddenly become a window into a reality I was never meant to see. And in that moment, something inside me went completely still. Not broken, not angry, still. Because I have spent 40 years in classrooms, in offices, in meetings where people underestimate quiet women. And I learned something a long time ago: when people think you're not paying attention, that's when you see everything. I gently placed the phone on the counter. I didn't hang up. I wanted to hear the rest. And what I heard next is something I haven't told anyone, not even Dorothy, my best friend of 45 years, the only person who has ever been able to read the things I don't say out loud. Rachel laughed, a small laugh. The kind she used to have when she was nervous. We just have to get through the wedding first, she said. Victoria replied, exactly. Once everything is official, things fall into place. Things fall into place. I picked up my tea, now cold, and took a sip anyway, because I needed something to anchor me in that moment. That was the second I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. You see, women are taught to react, to confront, to cry, to demand explanations. I've done all of that in my life, and do you know what it gets you? Temporary satisfaction and permanent misunderstanding. But silence gives you something much more powerful. Time. And I was about to use mine very carefully. I ended the call without saying a word. Rachel never even realized I had heard everything. That was her first mistake. I walked to my study, opened the drawer where I keep a notebook I've had for years. Not a diary, not emotions, just decisions. I sat down, picked up my pen, and wrote one sentence. I will not attend the wedding the way they expect me to. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet. But I knew one thing for certain. If my daughter believed I could be quietly moved to the background, then she had never truly understood the woman who raised her. And here's what I need you to understand, especially if you're a woman watching this. The moment someone decides you are too much, what they really mean is you are no longer convenient for them. And that's not your problem, that's your power. That evening, Dorothy called me. She always calls at the exact moment something is wrong, even when I haven't said a word. Margaret, she said, what happened? I looked out my window, the sun setting slowly, everything calm on the outside. Nothing, I replied, and then I paused. But something is about to. She didn't ask questions, she never does. Good, she said, because you've been quiet for too long. I smiled for the first time that day. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time in years I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. But what Rachel didn't know, what Victoria didn't know, and what changed everything that came after, was that I had already decided something much bigger than just the wedding. Something that would force all of them to see me not as someone to hide, but as someone they should have never underestimated. And the moment that plan began was not where you think it was. The next morning, I didn't call Rachel. I didn't confront her. I didn't even replay the conversation in my head the way most people would. No, I did something far more dangerous. I behaved exactly the same. Because the truth is, when people think you're unaware, they reveal far more than they ever would if they knew you were watching. And I needed to see everything. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., the same time I've woken up for the last 40 years, even though I've been retired for nearly a decade now. Routine is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. I made my coffee, sat in my usual chair by the window, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about the past. I thought about strategy. Because what Rachel said, what she agreed to, wasn't just a moment, it was a direction. And directions, if you don't interrupt them, become destinations. Around 9 o'clock a.m., my phone rang. Rachel. I looked at her name for a few seconds before answering, not because I was emotional, but because I was deciding who I would be in this conversation. Good morning, sweetheart, I said, calm, warm, exactly as always. Hi, Mom, she replied, and her voice carried that lightness people use when they believe everything is normal. I wanted to talk to you about the wedding details today. Of course you did, I thought. Out loud, I said, that sounds lovely. Lovely. It's a word that gives nothing away. She began explaining seating arrangements, timelines, color palettes, all the things that matter when you're planning a perfect day for people who care more about appearances than relationships. And I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, just observing, because when someone lies to you directly, you learn very little. But when they perform a version of the truth, that's where the real information is. We're keeping things very refined, Rachel said. Elegant, minimal, something that fits Ethan's family. Ethan, my future son-in-law, a man who had never once raised his voice to me, never disrespected me openly, and yet somehow managed to make me feel like I was always slightly out of place in his presence. That's a skill, by the way, disrespect without evidence. That sounds appropriate, I replied, and then I asked a question I already knew the answer to. And where will I be seated? There was a pause, a small one, most people wouldn't notice it. But I spent 30 years as a school principal. I've heard every kind of pause a person can make. This one was guilt trying to dress itself as thoughtfulness. Oh, we're still finalizing that, Rachel said, still finalizing. I almost smiled. Take your time, I said gently. I trust your judgment. And that's when something shifted, not in her, in me, because trust, when given to someone who is betraying you, doesn't weaken you, it reveals them. The call ended a few minutes later. She was cheerful, relieved, completely unaware that the version of me she believed she was managing no longer existed. By noon, I was sitting across from Dorothy Dottie, my best friend, my mirror, the only woman in my life who has never allowed me to lie to myself. We were in her kitchen, the same place we've had hundreds of conversations over the years. She didn't offer me tea, she didn't ask how I was, she just looked at me and said, "Tell me exactly what happened." So I did, every word. Every pause, every detail. When I finished, she didn't speak immediately. She just leaned back in her chair and studied me the way she always does when she's deciding how honest she's about to be. "And what are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said calmly. She raised an eyebrow. "Margaret, don't do that." "Do what?" "That thing where you pretend you're above it." I met her gaze. "I am above it." She shook her head. "No, you're hurt. And instead of admitting it, you're turning it into strategy." I didn't respond because she wasn't entirely wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. "Dottie," I said quietly, "if I confront Rachel now, what happens? You fight. And then," she sighed. "She defends herself, blames influence, says she didn't mean it." "Exactly," I said, "and nothing changes." Dottie leaned forward. "So what's your plan?" I took a slow breath. "I'm going to let them continue." She stared at me. "Continue what?" "Everything," I said. "The decisions, the assumptions, the positioning." "Margaret," she said slowly, "that sounds like you're giving them permission." I shook my head. "No, it sounds like I'm giving them time." That's the difference most people don't understand. Time doesn't just pass, it reveals. And I needed Rachel to go further. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed her to see herself clearly. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Isabel Grant, the wedding planner. Now Isabel is the kind of woman who has built her entire career on perfection. Every detail controlled, every moment curated. She represents a world where everything looks flawless even when it isn't. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, her voice professional but careful, "I wanted to confirm a few final details with you." I smiled slightly. Of course, there was a pause on her end, not uncertainty, hesitation. "There have been some adjustments," she said, "adjustments. Another word that means something much bigger than it sounds." "Go on," I replied. "The seating arrangement has been revised," she said. "The Cole family has requested a more traditional layout." Traditional. I could almost hear Victoria's voice behind that word. "And where does that place me?" I asked, my tone neutral. Another pause, longer this time. "Second row," she said finally. "Second row, not hidden, not removed, just repositioned." Subtly, respectfully, invisibly, I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there for a moment in complete silence. Because here's what most people don't realize: disrespect rarely arrives loudly. It comes in small adjustments, slight shifts, quiet decisions that over time move you further and further away from where you belong until one day you realize you're no longer part of the picture at all. That evening, Rachel came over, unannounced. She walked in the same way she always has, like this house still belonged to her, and in many ways it still did. "Hi, Mom," she said, smiling, placing her bag on the counter. "I thought we could go over a few things together." I nodded. "Of course." We sat at the table. She opened her laptop, started showing me designs, layouts, guest lists, a perfect presentation. And as I watched her, I realized something that hit deeper than anything she had said on that phone call. She wasn't trying to hurt me, she was trying to impress them. And in doing that, she had slowly started erasing the version of herself that once knew better. "Mom," she said at one point, not looking up, "I think this is going to be really beautiful." I looked at her. Really looked at her, and for a brief moment I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who didn't care about appearances, the one who would have never allowed anyone to push me aside. And then the moment passed. "I'm sure it will be," I said. She smiled, relieved again, and that's when I knew she still had no idea that I had heard everything, no idea that every decision she was making was being carefully noted. And most importantly, no idea that I had already begun to make mine. That night after she left, I sat in my study again, opened my notebook, and wrote something new. Respect that is negotiated is not respect. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself to feel something other than control, not anger, not sadness, clarity. Because the next step I was about to take wouldn't just change the wedding. It would change the way my daughter sees me forever. And what Rachel still doesn't know is that the moment she thinks everything is finally perfect is the exact moment everything begins to shift. 3 days later, I received an invitation to my own daughter's wedding, and the most important detail wasn't what was written on the card, it was what was missing. Now you might think an invitation is just paper, just formality, but when you've spent your life reading people the way I have, you learn this. What people leave out will always tell you more than what they include. It arrived in the afternoon, neatly placed in my mailbox like everything was perfectly normal. Cream envelope, gold lettering, elegant, controlled. Exactly the kind of presentation Ethan Cole and his mother Victoria would approve of. I held it in my hands for a moment longer than necessary before opening it. Not because I was excited, but because I already knew something inside it was going to confirm what I had been quietly observing. I walked inside, sat at my table, and opened it carefully. Not rushed, never rushed. Inside was a beautifully designed card. Rachel Ellis and Ethan Cole request the honor of your presence. I smiled slightly. Honor of your presence. Such a polite way to disguise distance. I continued reading. Date, time, venue, everything perfectly aligned. And then I looked for the part that mattered most. The role, the acknowledgement, the place a mother holds in her daughter's wedding. It wasn't there, no mention of mother of the bride. No special note, no recognition, just a guest. That was the moment everything became undeniable. You see, exclusion doesn't always come as rejection, sometimes it comes as equal treatment in a place where you were supposed to be irreplaceable. I placed the card back on the table and leaned back in my chair. And for the first time since that phone call, I let out a slow breath, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the picture was now complete. Rachel wasn't confused. She wasn't pressured, she was choosing this. And that clarity is a dangerous thing, because once you see the truth clearly, you can't unsee it. My phone rang an hour later. Isabel Grant, the wedding planner. Mrs. Ellis, she said, her voice softer than usual, I just wanted to confirm you received your invitation. Interesting, I thought, not did you like it? Not are you excited? Just confirmation. I did, I replied. It's very refined. There was a pause, the kind that doesn't come from uncertainty, but from knowing something isn't quite right. If you have any questions about logistics, she added carefully, logistics, that's what I had become. A logistical detail. No questions, I said calmly. Everything seems very clear. And I meant that, because clarity is not always comfortable, but it is always useful. After the call ended, I picked up my notebook again. I didn't write immediately. I just sat there thinking about something most women don't realize until it's too late. When someone starts redefining your role in their life, they rarely tell you directly. They show you slowly until one day you're already standing in a place you never agreed to. I finally wrote one sentence. If they reduce you quietly, respond deliberately. That evening, Dorothy came over. She didn't call first. She never does when she knows something is shifting. She walked in, saw the invitation on the table, and picked it up without asking. She read it once, then again, then she looked at me. Wow, she said, just one word. But the way she said it carried everything. I replied. She placed the card back down slowly. They really did it. Yes, I said, they did. She sat across from me, leaned forward slightly. And you're still sitting here, calm. I met her gaze. Would you prefer I wasn't? She shook her head. No, I just know you, and this kind of calm usually means you've already decided something. I didn't answer immediately. Because she was right, I had, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not even to her. Tell me something, Dottie, I said instead. When did respect become negotiable? She didn't hesitate. When people started confusing love with tolerance. I nodded slowly. Rachel thinks she's keeping the peace, I said. No, Dorothy replied firmly. She's choosing comfort. That landed exactly where it needed to. Because comfort is one of the most dangerous things in relationships. It makes you accept things you once would have walked away from. It makes you justify behavior you used to question. And if you're not careful, it slowly changes who you are. She wasn't raised like this, Dorothy added quietly. I looked at the invitation again. No, I said, she wasn't. And that's when the question finally surfaced. Not about Rachel. Not about the wedding, about me. Where did I go wrong? Because as much as we want to blame influence, people only change in directions they're willing to go. Dorothy must have seen it on my face. Don't do that, she said. Don't start rewriting your entire life because of one decision she's making now. It's not one decision, I replied. It's a pattern. And patterns don't appear overnight. They build quietly just like everything else. The next morning, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I attended a women's circle. Now I hadn't been to one of those in years. Not because I didn't believe in them, but because I had spent so much of my life being the one others came to for guidance. But this time, I needed perspective. That's where I met Elaine Foster, a woman I had heard about but never spoken to. She was 63, composed, observant, the kind of presence that doesn't demand attention but naturally holds it. She didn't ask me why I was there. She didn't ask anyone anything. She just said one sentence to the group. Most women don't lose themselves all at once, they lose themselves in small permissions. That sentence stayed with me. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Rachel hadn't become someone else overnight. She had simply allowed small compromises over and over again until they became her new standard. And then Elaine said something else. The moment you realize someone is reducing you, you have two choices. You either accept the new version they've created or you remind them who you've always been. I felt something shift inside me, not emotional, not reactive. Structural, because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what Rachel had done. I was thinking about what I had allowed, not in her behavior, but in my silence. And that's when I understood something most women don't realize until much later in life. Being calm is not the same as being passive, and I had been dangerously close to crossing that line. When I got home that afternoon, there was another message waiting for me. This time from Rachel. Mom, just checking if you got the invitation. Isn't it beautiful? I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to see what was underneath it. Excitement, validation, approval seeking. She wasn't asking how I felt. She was asking if it met expectations, just not mine. I typed back slowly. Yes, I received it. I paused, and then I added something she wasn't expecting. We should talk soon. 3 simple words. But sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight. She responded almost immediately. Of course, about what? I looked at the message for a moment, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small smile. Because now it was time, not for confrontation, not for emotion, for clarity. And what Rachel doesn't realize yet is that the conversation she thinks we're about to have is not the one that's actually coming. The truth is, my daughter thought we were about to have a simple conversation, but she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would quietly redefine everything between us. Because when a woman like me finally says, we need to talk, it's never about what just happened, it's about everything I chose not to say before. Please like and subscribe if you understand this kind of silence, because what I'm about to share might change how you see your own relationships. Rachel arrived exactly on time. Of course she did. I raised her that way. Precision, discipline, respect for time, all the things that make a woman successful in the world, but don't always protect her from losing herself in it. She walked in with that same polished presence she had developed over the past few years. Perfect posture, controlled smile. Everything about her said, I belong in rooms that expect perfection. But I also noticed something else. The slight hesitation in her eyes when she looked at me, not guilt, not exactly, something softer, uncertainty. Hi, Mom, she said, placing her bag neatly on the chair. You wanted to talk? I nodded and gestured toward the table. Sit. She sat back straight, hands folded lightly, prepared, or at least she thought she was. For a few seconds I didn't say anything. And that silence, it did exactly what silence is supposed to do. It made the truth uncomfortable enough to surface on its own. Is everything okay? She asked. There it was. The question people ask when they feel something is wrong but hope it isn't serious. I looked at her calmly. That depends, I said. On how honest you're willing to be today. She blinked slightly, just once, but I saw it. That moment when someone realizes this isn't going to be a light conversation. I'm always honest with you, she said. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached for the invitation and placed it gently between us. Tell me what this is, I said. She glanced at it quickly. It's my wedding invitation. No, I said quietly, it's not. That's when the air shifted. Not dramatically, but enough for her to feel it. What do you mean? She asked, her voice slightly tighter now. I leaned forward just a little, not aggressively, just enough to make my presence clear. This, I said, tapping the card lightly, is a message. She frowned. Mom, it's just… No, I interrupted gently, not raising my voice. Nothing is ever just anything when it comes to how people position you in their lives. She looked at me now. Fully, and I could see it, the beginning of defensiveness. You're overthinking it, she said. Am I? I asked calmly. Then I paused and let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Where, I continued softly, is your mother on this invitation? She opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no answer that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was. Exclusion. It's just a design choice, she said finally. Ethan and I wanted something clean, modern, I nodded slowly. And removing your mother made it cleaner, that hit, not loudly, but precisely. That's not what I meant, she said quickly. Then what did you mean? I asked, and there it was. The moment most people avoid, the moment where truth has only two options: come out or be replaced with something weaker. She looked down for a second, then back at me. It wasn't just my decision, she admitted. Of course it wasn't. It never is, Ethan, I asked. She hesitated. And Victoria had some input. There it was, finally something honest. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not surprised, just confirming what I already knew. And what was their concern? I asked. Rachel shifted in her seat. They just wanted everything to feel consistent. I almost smiled. Consistent, such a polite word for controlled. Consistent with what? I asked. She didn't answer right away, because now she understood. This wasn't about the invitation anymore. This was about something deeper, something she had been avoiding. Their world is different, Mom, she said finally. There are expectations. I nodded slowly. And where, I asked, do I fit into those expectations? Silence. Real silence this time, not the comfortable kind, the kind that forces reflection. You don't understand how these things work, she said quietly. No, I replied. I understand perfectly. And I did, better than she thought, because I had spent a lifetime watching how people use politeness to mask rejection. You're trying to build a life that feels elevated, I continued calmly. And somewhere along the way, you started seeing me as something that needed to be adjusted. Her eyes widened slightly. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked. Again, no anger, just clarity. Tell me something, Rachel, I said. When did being raised with values become something you needed to distance yourself from? That question landed deeper than anything else I had said. Because it wasn't about Ethan, it wasn't about Victoria, it was about her. And for the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. I watched her carefully. The way I used to watch students when they were struggling between what they knew was right and what they were about to choose anyway. I'm not distancing myself from you, she said, but her voice was softer now. Less certain. No, I said gently, you're just repositioning me. And that is something many women don't notice until it's too late. You're still invited. Still included, still acknowledged, just not where you used to stand. And that shift is everything. Ethan just wants everything to look right, she added almost defensively. I nodded. Presentation is important to him. Yes, she said quickly, relieved to have something clear. Exactly. And what about you? I asked. That stopped her again. What about me? She said. Do you also believe, I asked quietly, that anything imperfect should be hidden? She didn't answer. Because now we weren't talking about invitations anymore. We were talking about identity, about values. About the quiet choices that slowly shape who you become. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Then I said something she wasn't expecting. I'm not angry. She looked up immediately, surprised. You're not? No, I said calmly. Because anger comes from confusion, and I'm not confused anymore. That shifted everything. Because now she realized this wasn't emotional, it was intentional. Then what is this? She asked quietly. I folded my hands on the table. The same way I had done in countless meetings, countless conversations where clarity mattered more than comfort. This, I said, is me deciding where I stand. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? I held her gaze steady, unmoving. It means, I said, the version of me you're trying to fit into your new world doesn't exist. Silence. Heavy now, real. Mom, she started, but I raised my hand slightly, not to stop her, but to slow the moment down. I gave you everything I had, I said. Not just comfort, not just support, values, strength, identity. My voice didn't break, it didn't need to. And I will not shrink those things so they can match someone else's expectations. She swallowed hard. And for the first time I saw it, not defensiveness, not justification, doubt, small but there. I didn't realize it felt like that, she said quietly. No, I replied. You didn't, because most people don't realize what they're doing when they're busy trying to belong somewhere else. I stood up slowly, not dramatically, just decisively. We're not finished talking, I said. But this part needed to be clear first. She looked up at me, something unsettled in her expression now, something new. What happens now? She asked. I paused for a moment. Just long enough to let the weight of what I was about to say settle in the room. Then I looked at her. Now, I said calmly, you decide what kind of woman you want to be before this wedding decides it for you. And as I walked away from that table, I knew something she didn't yet understand. The real conflict hadn't even begun. The truth is, the moment I stopped reacting, they started watching me more carefully than ever. Because people like Ethan and Victoria don't fear anger, they fear silence they can't control. And what I did next wasn't loud, but it changed the balance completely. If you've ever felt underestimated in a room where everyone thinks they understand you, stay with me. What I'm about to show you is where everything quietly begins to turn. After Rachel left that evening, I didn't call her back. I didn't send a message. I didn't explain myself further. I simply stopped. And that kind of stillness is unfamiliar to people who are used to controlling the narrative. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Rachel, my daughter, 33 years old, and for the first time in a long time, unsure of how to approach me. I let it ring twice before answering, not to play games, but to remind her that access is no longer automatic. Hi, Mom. Her voice was softer now, careful. I could hear it. Good morning, Rachel, I replied calmly, always calm. That's what unsettles people the most. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued. I didn't interrupt. Silence again, let her come to it. Maybe we can adjust a few things, she added quickly. Adjust, not change, not correct. Adjust, I noticed that immediately. What kind of adjustments? I asked. My tone stayed neutral. She hesitated. We could include your name somewhere, maybe on a separate insert, or I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration. In clarity, because now I understood exactly where she stood. Rachel, I said gently, I'm not asking to be added. That confused her. I could hear it in the way she exhaled. Then what do you want? She asked. That question always sounds simple, but it rarely is. I want to see who you are without influence, I said quietly. Silence. Long this time, because now she had nothing prepared. Ethan just wants things to be perfect, she said finally. There it was again, his voice through her words. And what does perfect look like to you? I asked. She didn't answer immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. Because when a woman can't define her own version of perfect, she's usually living inside someone else's. We'll talk later, she said quickly, almost retreating. I have a meeting. Of course you do, I replied calmly. And then I ended the call, not coldly, not emotionally, just finished. By noon, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected. Isabel Grant, the wedding planner, professional, polished, always controlled. Mrs. Ellis, she said, her tone respectful but slightly tense. I wanted to discuss a few adjustments regarding the event structure. Adjustments again, interesting. Go ahead, I said. There have been some conversations about guest positioning, family acknowledgments, and overall presentation, she explained carefully. She chose every word like she was walking on glass. And, I asked, a pause. There's concern about maintaining a consistent image. I almost smiled. That word again. Image. It's amazing how often people build entire lives around something that disappears the moment truth enters the room. And who is concerned? I asked. She hesitated just slightly. Mrs. Cole has expressed preferences. Of course she has. Victoria Cole, the future mother-in-law, elegant, calculated. A woman who never raises her voice because she doesn't need to. And what are those preferences? I asked calmly. Isabel exhaled softly. She believes certain elements should be simplified. Simplified, I leaned back in my chair. Does that include me? Silence. And that silence answered everything. Mrs. Ellis, Isabel said carefully, my role is to execute the vision of the family. No, I interrupted gently. Your role is to manage an event, not erase people from it. That shifted her tone immediately. I understand, she said quickly, and I respect your position. I just wanted to ensure there are no misunderstandings moving forward. There aren't, I said. Good, she replied, because things are becoming delicate. Delicate, that's what people call it when control starts slipping. After I hung up, I didn't react. I didn't rush to fix anything. I simply sat there and thought. And then I made one call. Dottie, I said when she answered. Dorothy Dottie Lane, my best friend, the only person who doesn't soften the truth for me. Well, she said immediately, you finally stopped pretending everything was fine. I almost smiled. You already know? I always know, she replied. Now tell me, how bad is it? I told her everything. The invitation, the conversation with Rachel, the call from Isabel, the quiet pressure building behind polite words. When I finished, she didn't speak for a few seconds, and that's when I knew she was about to say something I might not like. You waited too long, she said finally, not harsh, just honest. I was observing, I replied. No, she said. You were hoping. That landed, because it was true. Hoping she'd remember who she is, she continued. Hoping love would be stronger than influence. Hoping you wouldn't have to choose between being her mother and being respected. I didn't respond. Because there was nothing to argue with. So what now? She asked. That question again. What now? I looked out the window for a moment, thought about Rachel as a child. The way she used to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Now, I said slowly, I stop hoping and start deciding. Dottie didn't reply immediately, and when she did, her voice was different, softer. Good, she said, because the longer you stay silent without direction, the more they'll mistake it for acceptance. That's something every woman needs to understand. Silence is powerful, but only when it's intentional. Otherwise, it becomes permission. That evening, Rachel came home again, unannounced this time, which told me everything. She wasn't in control anymore. She walked in quickly, her energy different now, less polished, more unsettled. Mom, we need to talk, she said. I nodded slightly. We do. She sat down, but not the way she had before. This time, there was no performance. No perfect posture, just tension. Ethan thinks you're overreacting, she said, direct this time, no softening, no filters. Of course he does, I replied calmly. He doesn't understand why this matters so much, she continued. I looked at her carefully. Do you? I asked. That stopped her, again, because now she couldn't hide behind Ethan's perspective. She started, then paused. I just want everything to go smoothly. There it was, not truth, not values. Just convenience. Smooth, I repeated quietly. Rachel, do you know what smooth usually costs? She frowned slightly. What? I held her gaze. Someone's dignity. Silence, heavy now, real. That's not what I'm doing, she said quickly. Isn't it? I asked. And this time, my voice wasn't just calm, it was firm. Because from where I'm standing, you're asking me to accept less so your life feels easier. That hit harder than anything else. I could see it in her eyes, the shift, the realization she didn't want but couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't think of it like that, she said quietly. No, I replied, you didn't. And that is how it always begins. Not with cruelty, not with intention, but with small compromises that slowly become who you are. I stood up slowly, walked toward the window. Let the silence sit between us one more time. There's something you need to understand, I said without turning around. This isn't about a wedding. She didn't respond, because now she was listening, really listening. This is about the moment a woman decides whether she will shrink to belong or stand and risk being alone. I turned to face her. And for the first time, she looked unsure of which one she was choosing. And Rachel, I said quietly, that decision doesn't happen on your wedding day. I paused, let it settle, let it stay unfinished. It happens long before that. And as she sat there, trying to process everything she had just heard, I could see it clearly. The doubt had begun, but what she would do with that doubt would decide everything that came next. The truth is, people don't panic when you argue with them. They panic when you quietly remove yourself from their control. Because arguments they can manage, emotions they can manipulate, but distance exposes everything. And what I did next wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it forced everyone to reveal who they really were. If you've ever wondered what happens when a woman finally stops negotiating her worth, stay with me. This is where everything shifts. The next morning, I didn't call Rachel. I didn't call Isabel. I didn't respond to a single message. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I chose myself without explanation. At 9 a.m., I was sitting in a quiet room across from a woman I had only heard about once before. Elaine Foster, 63, calm in a way that felt earned, not practiced. The kind of woman who doesn't fill silence because she understands it. "What brings you here?" she asked gently. Simple question, but the kind that doesn't accept simple answers. I paused for a moment. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it correctly. "I think I've spent most of my life being defined by what I give to others," I said. She nodded slightly. "And now," I continued, "I'm being asked to reduce myself to fit into someone else's version of acceptable." She didn't react immediately. She just observed me, the way I observe others, and that told me something important. This woman understood me. "And what are you choosing?" she asked, that question again. "It follows you until you answer it honestly." "I'm choosing to step back," I said, not out of anger but out of clarity. Elaine leaned back slightly in her chair. "Good," she said softly, "because stepping back is often the first time a woman actually sees the full picture." I let that settle, because she was right. Distance doesn't just protect you, it reveals things you couldn't see while you were inside the situation. "What if it costs me my relationship with my daughter?" I asked. For the first time, something personal slipped through. Elaine's expression didn't change, but her voice softened just enough. "Then the question isn't what it costs you," she said. "The question is what it costs you to stay." That stayed with me, because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about losing Rachel. I was thinking about losing myself, and that is always the greater loss. When I got home, my phone was full. Missed calls, messages, emails, Rachel, Isabel, even an unknown number I didn't recognize. I didn't open any of them immediately. Instead, I made tea, sat down, and read them slowly. Rachel. "Mom, please call me. We need to fix this." Isabel, "There are urgent decisions that require your input." Unknown number, "Margaret, this is Victoria Cole. I believe it's time we speak directly." I read that last one twice. Not surprised, just noting the timing. Because when someone like Victoria reaches out directly, it means the situation is no longer under control. I waited exactly 1 hour before calling her back. Not to create tension, but to establish something very clear. "I respond when I choose to, not when I'm pressured to," she answered immediately. Of course she did. "Margaret," she said smoothly, "I'm glad you returned my call." Her voice was exactly what I expected. Polite, warm, carefully measured. "Victoria," I replied, "how can I help you?" A small pause. She didn't expect that. She expected defensiveness or emotion. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she began. "Of course, there always is when someone is losing control of a situation they carefully constructed." "Is there?" I asked calmly. "Yes," she continued. "And I believe it's important we handle this with grace." Grace, another interesting word, often used when someone wants you to accept something quietly. "What exactly needs to be handled?" I asked. She exhaled softly. "The tension surrounding the wedding," she said. "It's creating unnecessary complications." I almost smiled. "Unnecessary to whom?" "I see," I replied. "And what would you suggest?" There was a slight shift in her tone now. Subtle, but there. "I believe," she said carefully, "that sometimes, in order to maintain harmony, certain adjustments must be made." Adjustments again. That word had been following me for days now. "And who," I asked, "is expected to adjust?" Silence. "Just for a second, but enough." "Margaret," she said, her voice still smooth, "this isn't about individuals, it's about the overall experience." There it was, the removal of individuality for the sake of appearance. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I've spent my entire life educating young people to understand their value." I paused, let the weight of that settle. "I'm not about to forget mine now." That changed the tone completely. Not dramatically, but enough for her to realize this wasn't going to go the way she planned. "No one is asking you to forget your value," she said. "Then what exactly are you asking?" I replied. and this time I didn't soften it. Another pause, longer now, because now she had to choose her words more carefully. "I'm asking for cooperation," she said finally. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see it. "Cooperation requires mutual respect," I said. "And respect doesn't exist where someone is being quietly removed." That was the first moment. She didn't have an immediate response, because politeness can only carry you so far before truth interrupts it. "I think," she said after a moment, "you may be interpreting things too personally." And there it was, the final move. When someone can't justify their actions, they question your perception. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm interpreting them exactly as they are." Silence again, but this time it wasn't uncertain, it was controlled. "Then perhaps," she said, "we need to reconsider certain arrangements." I leaned back slightly in my chair. Because now we had arrived at the real conversation. Not invitations, not seating, power. "Perhaps we do," I said, and then I did something she didn't expect. I ended the call, not abruptly, not rudely, just decisively. Because the conversation was finished, and I had made my position clear. That evening, Rachel showed up again, but this time she didn't walk in quickly. She paused at the door, and that told me everything. She wasn't coming to argue anymore. She was coming uncertain. "Mom," she said softly. I looked at her, really looked at her, not the version shaped by Ethan, not the version influenced by Victoria, just my daughter. And for the first time in a long time, I saw it. The conflict. The internal struggle she couldn't hide anymore. "I talked to Ethan," she said. "And," I asked. She hesitated. "He thinks you're making things harder than they need to be." I nodded. "Of course he does." But she added quietly. I waited. "But I don't feel right about this anymore," she said. And that was the first real shift, not a solution, not a decision, just discomfort with what she had accepted before. And sometimes that's where change begins. "Why?" I asked gently. She looked down for a moment, then back at me. "Because I keep hearing what you said," she admitted. "About dignity." Silence, not heavy this time, just honest. "And I don't know if I'm protecting mine," she added. I didn't respond immediately because this moment wasn't about guiding her, it was about letting her think, really think. "I need time," she said finally. I nodded. "Then take it." No pressure, no direction, just space. Because growth doesn't happen when someone tells you what to do, it happens when you realize what you've been doing on your own. She stood there for a moment, then asked something she hadn't asked before. "Will you still be there?" I looked at her carefully, because this question mattered. "That depends," I said softly, "on who you become before that day arrives." And as she stood there, processing that, I knew something she didn't yet understand. The decision she was about to make wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was about the kind of woman she would be long after it ended. The truth is, there comes a moment when silence is no longer protection, it becomes pressure. Because once the truth settles in your mind, you can't unknow it, and you can't keep pretending everything is fine. And what Rachel did next was something she had been avoiding for a long time. She stopped asking what was easier and started facing what was real. If you've ever stood at a point where your comfort and your values were pulling you in opposite directions, you'll understand exactly what happened next. 3 days passed, no calls, no messages, no updates. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to reach out, because this wasn't my decision to guide anymore. It was hers to make. On the 4th day, everything moved at once. It started with a call from Isabel Grant, the wedding planner. Her voice, usually composed, carried something different this time. Urgency. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, "we have a situation." I didn't rush. "Go ahead," I replied calmly. "Rachel has requested a full revision of the wedding structure," she said. I paused slightly, not surprised but attentive. "What kind of revision?" "Guest hierarchy, family acknowledgements, even the ceremony flow," Isabel continued. "And," I asked, a small breath on the other end, "it directly contradicts Mrs. Cole's original directives." There it was, not a misunderstanding anymore, a shift, a real one. "I see," I said quietly. "And how is that being received?" Isabel hesitated. "Not well." "Of course not, because control doesn't step aside quietly. It resists, it tightens, it reveals itself." "Thank you for informing me," I said. "I'll handle my part." I ended the call and sat still for a moment, not reacting, just understanding, because something important had just happened. Rachel had made her first move, not perfect, not complete, but real. That evening, she came to see me again. But this time, there was no hesitation at the door, no uncertainty in her steps, just resolve. Mom, she said, standing in front of me. I looked at her carefully, and I could see it. Not confidence, not yet, but clarity, and that matters more. I spoke to Ethan, she said, and, I asked. She exhaled slowly. It didn't go the way I thought it would. I nodded slightly. It rarely does when you stop agreeing. She gave a small, almost tired smile. He said I was complicating things, she continued, that I was letting emotions interfere with what should be a simple process. That sounded exactly like Ethan. Polished, logical, controlled, and completely disconnected from what actually matters. And what did you say? I asked. She looked at me directly now. I told him it's not simple when it costs me something I can't get back. Silence. Not heavy, just honest. He didn't like that, she added. No, I said, he wouldn't. Because people who benefit from your silence rarely appreciate your voice. Then I spoke to Victoria, she continued. That caught my attention. Not because I was surprised, but because I understood what that required. And, I asked. Rachel hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but out of remembering. She was very polite, she said. I almost smiled. Of course she was, that's where her control lives. But underneath that, Rachel continued, she made it clear if things change too much, it affects how they see this marriage. There it was, the real pressure, not about flowers. Not about invitations, about acceptance, belonging, position. And how do you see it? I asked quietly, that question again, but this time she was ready for it. I see that I've been trying to fit into something instead of building something, she said. That was the first moment I felt something shift completely, not just in the situation but in her, because that realization changes everything. And what are you going to do about it? I asked. She didn't hesitate this time. I told them the wedding would reflect both families or it wouldn't happen at all. Silence, deep, real, final, because now this wasn't uncertainty anymore. This was a decision. I studied her carefully because this moment mattered. And Ethan, I asked. She looked down briefly, then back up. He said I was being influenced, she replied. By you. I almost smiled, not out of amusement but recognition, because that's always the assumption. A woman can't choose strength on her own, she must be influenced. And are you? I asked. She shook her head slowly. No, she said, I'm just remembering who I was before I started trying to be someone else. That is the moment every woman needs to reach. Not rebellion, not anger, just remembrance. I stood up slowly, walked closer to her, not to comfort her but to stand with her. That's not an easy place to return to, I said. I know, she replied quietly. But it feels right. And that's how you know, not because it's comfortable, but because it's true. Just then her phone rang. She looked at the screen and I could tell immediately. Ethan? I asked. She nodded, and for a moment she hesitated. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she understood what this call represented. A test, not of love but of boundaries. Answer it, I said calmly. She did. Hi, she said, her voice steady. I couldn't hear Ethan, but I didn't need to. I could see everything in her expression. The tightening of her jaw, the shift in her posture, the moment pressure was applied. I've already explained my position, she said. A pause, longer this time. Then, no, I'm not changing it. Silence, then something different, something stronger. Because this isn't about the wedding anymore, she said. I watched her closely now because this was the moment. It's about how I live my life after it, she continued. Another pause, and then the final line. And I'm not going to build that life by pretending my own mother doesn't belong in it. She ended the call, not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. And when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Not doubt, not confusion, strength, not perfect, not complete, but real. I don't know what happens next, she said quietly. I nodded. You don't need to, I replied. You just need to stand where you are. She exhaled slowly. And for the first time, she looked lighter. Not because the situation was resolved, but because she had stopped carrying something that wasn't hers. Later that night, I received one final message from Victoria Cole. Short, polite, controlled. It seems we need to revisit certain expectations. I read it once, then set my phone down, because I already knew something she didn't yet fully understand. This wasn't about expectations anymore. This was about boundaries. And once a woman sets those clearly, everything changes. But what would happen next would test whether those boundaries could actually hold. The final moment isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't look like victory the way people expect. It looks like clarity. Quiet, steady clarity, where everyone in the room finally understands exactly where they stand. And on that day, I didn't need to prove anything because the truth had already done the work for me. If you've ever wondered what real strength looks like when everything is on the line, this is it. The morning of the wedding arrived calm. Not perfect, not chaotic, just calm in a way that felt earned. I woke up early, not because I had to, but because my body knew this day mattered. I made my tea the same way I always do, sat by the window. And for a moment, I didn't think about Rachel or Ethan or Victoria. I thought about myself. 65 years of being a woman who gave, who taught, who guided, and who, for the first time in a long time, chose not to disappear. That was enough. When I arrived at the venue, Isabel Grant, the wedding planner, met me at the entrance. Professional as always, but her eyes told a different story. Respect. Not forced, not polite, real. "Mrs. Ellis," she said. "Everything is ready," I nodded. "Thank you, Isabel." She hesitated for a moment, then added quietly, "It's different from the original plan." I looked at her. "Good," I said, because different doesn't mean wrong, it means real. As I stepped inside, I noticed something immediately. The atmosphere had changed. Not in decoration, not in arrangement, but in energy. It wasn't trying so hard anymore. It wasn't performing perfection. It was simply present. Rachel stood near the front, speaking softly with someone. My daughter, 33 years old and finally standing in her own space. She saw me, and for a brief second, everything else faded. No audience, no expectations, just us. She walked toward me, not rushed, not hesitant, steady. "Mom," she said. I looked at her carefully, and I saw it. Not the polished version the world admired, not the controlled version Ethan preferred, just Rachel. "You look like yourself," I said quietly. She smiled, a real one this time. "I think I finally am," she replied. That was all I needed to hear. Then I noticed something else. Ethan Cole, her future husband, standing a few feet away. Composed as always, but different. Less certain, because for the first time, the situation wasn't shaped around his expectations. He walked over. "Margaret," he said, his tone still polite, still controlled. "I hope you're comfortable with the arrangements." I held his gaze, calm, unshaken. "I'm comfortable with honesty," I replied, a pause just long enough. "And this feels closer to that." He nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing. Just adjusting, because that's what happens when control is replaced with clarity. Victoria Cole arrived shortly after, elegant as ever, perfect posture, measured steps. A woman who built her world on presentation, now standing in a room that no longer fully followed her script. She approached me directly. "Of course she did. Margaret," she said smoothly, "it seems today has taken a slightly different direction." I nodded. "Yes," I replied, "it has." She studied me for a moment. The way someone does when they're trying to understand where their influence ends. "I hope," she continued, "this new direction is satisfactory." I met her gaze without hesitation. "It's honest," I said. "And that's more important?" That was the moment she understood, not emotionally, not dramatically, strategically, because she recognized something she couldn't negotiate with, boundaries that weren't moving. She gave a small, polite nod. "Then I suppose we proceed." And just like that, the power dynamic shifted completely, not because anyone fought for it, but because someone stopped giving it away. The ceremony began, simple, clean, real, no excessive performance. No forced elegance, just two people standing in front of the lives they were about to build. I sat in the front row, not because I demanded it, not because I argued for it, but because that's where I belonged, and everyone in that room finally understood it. As Rachel stood there, I watched her carefully. Not as a mother hoping everything would be perfect, but as a woman observing another woman step into her own life. And I could see it, the awareness, the strength, the quiet understanding of what it took to get here. When she spoke her vows, her voice didn't shake. "I promise," she said, "to build a life that doesn't require me to lose who I am." I felt something settle in my chest. Not pride, something deeper, recognition, because she had learned the lesson, not from what I said, but from what I refused to accept. After the ceremony, people gathered, conversations filled the space, laughter returned. But I stayed where I was for a moment, just observing. That's what I do, that's who I am. Dottie found me first, Dorothy Dottie Lane, my best friend. She looked at me, then at the room, then back at me. Well, she said, you didn't just sit quietly this time. I smiled slightly. I did, I replied. I just chose where to be quiet. She laughed softly. That's new. No, I said, that's clarity. She nodded because she understood. She always does. Later, Rachel came to me again, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman sharing a moment. You stayed, she said quietly. I looked at her. You stood, I replied. That's why I could. She nodded slowly. And in that moment, there was no tension, no confusion, just understanding. Ethan joined us shortly after, still composed, still measured, but different now. I think, he said carefully, today went better than expected. I looked at him. Expectations change, I said. Reality stays. He didn't respond immediately, but I could see it. The beginning of something, not transformation, not yet, but awareness. And that's where it always starts. As the evening settled, I stepped outside for a moment. Needed air, needed space. The kind that reminds you you're still your own person even after everything. That's where I saw her again. Elaine Foster. Standing quietly, observing the same way I do. You didn't lose yourself, she said, not a question, a statement. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied. You found something better, she added. I looked at her. What's that? She smiled gently. Yourself, without needing anyone else to confirm it. That stayed with me because that's the real ending, not the wedding, not the conflict. The moment a woman no longer waits for permission to exist fully in her own life. As I stood there, I realized something important. This was never about being included. It was about refusing to be reduced. And that lesson doesn't end with a wedding. It follows you into every room, every relationship, every decision. When I walked back inside, everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. And that changes everything.